All right, just watch the last episode of Game of Thrones. It's an end of an era, and it's the question of why is everything so meaningless in that show. Let's untangle that knot. So it's been a wonderful 8 seasons with a lot of ups and downs. Not all of it has been great, but a lot of it has been interesting and certainly epic. And the biggest difference that Game of Thrones has been bringing to the table, in contrast to something like Lord of the Rings, which is the famous fantasy novel, right? What's the biggest difference, right? In Lord of the Rings, everything, there's a clear good and evil, there's a clear sense of purpose, right? A clear sense of moral struggle, clarity, epic defeat, epic victory. It's like that. In Game of Thrones, I mean, like in the first episode, they have like prostitutes, like it's filthy. There's some glory and heroism here and there, but it's really kind of subsumed in a larger narrative of questionable morals, very gray moral landscape, very gray like personalities. People are kind of just debating if they're good or evil, or really no one's good or evil. Everyone's just kind of whatever, pursuing their wants and needs. Anyway, so the show has been structured as this kind of antithesis to Lord of the Rings, as like the opposite kind of fantasy that's not based on morals, based on purpose and clarity, but it's based on vagueness, moral ambiguity, kind of like who knows what the truth is, what is the truth, right? Like that, right? And what's interesting is, even though people have bought into this premise for the last 8 seasons, right? And people like me would criticize the show for being too morally gray. And people would say, well, that's just the grown-up version of Lord of the Rings. Like, we're not in kindergarten anymore with things being clear. Now, in the grown-up world, it's complicated, it's confusing, therefore, the show matches reality of the world. So, grow up, and just that's how the world is, and that's how the show is. But, when the show has ended, right, a lot of people were mad at the fact that things were kind of left a little bit pointless. More than, in fact, everything has been kind of pointless. Like, nothing's been wrapped up and finished in a neat way. Like, the show kind of ended in a very awkward manner, right? Jon Snow was discovered. This is going to be a lot of spoilers. So if you haven't seen the show, make sure you watch it first before you continue on this, because this is going to be, everything will be revealed. But, Jon Snow is basically the long-lost heir of the Targaryens. He's the rightful heir to the throne. And they've built up this incredible surprise to why that this like unknown bastard, child of a family rises through the ranks to become this great hero was promised, and yet nothing happened. In fact, the show ended and somebody else became king, despite this build-up for the last 8 years. And he just became a guy that went up into the north and disappeared. That was the end of him. No great, satisfying conclusion to his story arc, right? And then what about, the fact that Brandon Stark, okay, this kind of like invalid, disabled child who's been kind of just carried on other people's backs for 8 seasons, has done nothing heroic, hasn't been a bad character, has done nothing wrong, but hasn't done anything great. It was just kind of like a guy that like, he's literally just carried on people's backs for 8 seasons, to here, to there, things happen to him, and he doesn't really do anything for 8 seasons. And then in the last episode, they make him the king. The person that has been building up has in fact been castigated into irrelevancy. And his story arc was amazing. Everyone was hooked last season of like, he's going to be the great hero that will save everything, and nothing happened. Of course, the biggest crisis of that meaning in the show, that there is no meaning in the show, happened a few episodes ago when the Night King, who was the great villain for the show, has been gathering his army of minions and villains and zombies from the north, and having this massive horde come down and about to annihilate the realms of men. He comes in, and he gets defeated in the first battle, and he's dead. And every zombie he brought with him is dead in the first battle. So he's not the main villain at all. So and what became the main villain, this evil queen Cersei, who, after the Night King was killed, she was, okay, like we think now she's the main villain. Yeah, she was kind of bad after that, but then she got killed when basically the roof collapsed on her head, right? So what I find interesting in all these meaningless things is I would expect these from the show. Like ever since what's his name? The guy, whatever, the king of the Starks, the famous Sean Bean, famous actor in the first season, the noble king, very, very virtuous, gets executed in a very small way, in a very silly way, like early on, and everybody was like, "Ooh, this is crazy." Ever since then, I knew the show is meant to be anti-meaning, anti-purpose, and I was watching it. That's why I don't like it. I was watching it just to see morbidly how they would stretch out this sort of nihilistic message. But everybody fell in love with the show for subverting expectations and kind of playing with people's expectations and playing with what people thought and produced a different answer or different solutions than what they would expect. But when the show kept with that and didn't stop that, in fact, did that even worse than ever in the final season, in the final episode of the final season, people got upset that they didn't get their neat ending, they didn't get their clean conclusion, that people should have, that who should have gotten to be the king became king. They were upset that the guy that should not have been king became king. People that were upset that the villain was killed in a very mindless way, that the great other villainess was killed in a very sort of purposeless way. So them being upset about meaninglessness of the show, despite celebrating and championing this kind of grown-up fantasy, means that we haven't actually graduated from Lord of the Rings. Like, we haven't actually decided as a culture that it's time to put that innocent, naive stuff of heroism behind and move on to the cynical stuff. In fact, we're still living in the purposeful mindset. We want that from our stories. Even the most jaded, hardened cynics that have been watching Game of Thrones for the last 8 seasons are still convinced that the Lord of the Rings model is basically the right model, that the worthy person has to get what they deserve. The evil person has to sort of have a recompense for what they've done. The person that hasn't done anything, that doesn't deserve it, shouldn't get something important. That basically good triumphs and evil suffers. At the end, they all expect that, and it didn't happen. And it shows to me that when they were upset about that they still wanted it, despite 8 seasons. Therefore, the message of the cynical fantasy or the cynical stories that have purposelessness is not a message that sticks to people. And sort of the naive, the innocent, for me the words like naive and innocent aren't bad words. I think that's like the best words. That we all want innocence, we all want goodness and truth and justice and fairness, equality, right? Purpose, meaning, we all want those things. And shows that subvert that only temporarily sort of distract us from our wanting that real goodness. And in the end, even for those shows, we want to return to those goodness. And when they don't, we're mad at the shows. We're not mad at ourselves for being deluded to think that a show with no meaning would find some meaning in the end. It's a meaningless show. So I've seen people say, I've wasted the last 8 years or the last 9 years watching the show, being invested in it because I didn't get a payoff. Well, you should have known. If you watch Game of Thrones from the first season and you watched your favorite, the most noble character get executed in a meaningless way with, prostitutes in the first episode doing stuff on camera, you should have known to expect that this is not a show with wholesomeness and purpose and morality at its core. And when they subverted that yet again and sort of undermined your innocence of what goodness is, what truth is, you should have expected that. And I think we should all go back to Lord of the Rings and watch that, in my case, for the 14th time.
Yeah, good call.